Welcome back to the third video in our study design series. Now that we have reviewed the scientific method and some important terms, we are ready to learn about the first study design, randomized controlled trials. In public health, you will be responsible for distinguishing between different study designs and identifying which would be best to accomplish a certain goal. There are many more study designs than what we were able to go over in this video series, but this information is meant to expose you to the main three and show you what to focus on as you develop studying strategies. This first study design we will discuss are randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. This is an experimental study design. In an RCT, we are basically asking if changing the exposure changes the outcome. And the exposure is manipulated by researchers. Study subjects for the intervention and control groups are randomly chosen, and usually the participants or the researchers, or both, are blinded, meaning they don't know who is in which group. Random assignment and blinding both help eliminate sources of bias. Strengths and weaknesses are good to focus on when we are learning about study designs. Some of the strengths of using RCTs are that they are considered the gold standard in study designs because they have the highest validity and lowest concern for confounding. They are free of bias because the researcher has no input on which subjects are put in each group. And the last strength is that RCTs are the best for proving temporality. Recall that temporality is referring to that cause and effect relationship, and we always want that to be as strong as possible. Because none of the research participants begins with the outcome of interest, and the only difference between the case and control groups is treatment or intervention, we can conclude that any difference is due to the intervention. Some of the limitations of using RCTs include the potential for ethical concerns, meaning this type of study cannot always be used. You can imagine that manipulating the exposure to something potentially harmful would not be ethical, which is why we can't always use RCTs. We couldn't randomly choose to expose some people to, say, radiation or tobacco or asbestos, or really any other carcinogen to see if they end up with cancer. More limitations of RCTs are that they are time-consuming, expensive, and cannot always be used if the exposure to something cannot be randomly assigned. For example, you cannot randomly assign exposures that are common or present naturally, like UV light, because the majority of people get daily sun exposure on their own. Here's an example of a randomized controlled trial. Say you want to determine if a new oral nicotine inhaler will improve the outcomes for smokers trying to quit. So as a review, take a moment to see if you can identify the exposure and outcome here. The exposure would be the oral nicotine inhaler, which is the intervention manipulated by researchers, and the outcome would be whether an individual quit smoking. Also think about what you would have to give the control group here. In this case, some kind of placebo inhaler would be appropriate, so none of the participants knew if they were receiving the intervention. Now, why is RCT a good option here? Well, we don't see any ethical concerns with the exposure, since we're trying to improve health. The people here are already choosing to expose themselves to nicotine by smoking, so we're not adding anything else that's potentially harmful here. So to recap, video number 3 went over some important properties of randomized controlled trials, including manipulation of the exposures by researchers and random assignment to the case and control groups. We also went over some important pros and cons of this study design. Please continue to video number 4 to learn about the next study design, cohort studies.